Welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion in conversation with thought leaders and DEI experts. Each episode, I ask our guests one key question and a bunch of follow-up questions, highlighting their area of expertise in DEI. The goal is to leave you with the tools and insights that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm a DEI educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which, by the way, is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional lands of the Attawandaron and the Haudenosaunee peoples. On this week's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Christine Platt. After working in curatorial and education in fine arts, including at the Museum of Inuit Art and in public exhibitions with Indigenous artists in Canada, such as Christy Belcourt and Bonnie Devine, Christine shifted to homemaking for 5 years to raise her family. 2.5 years ago, Christine joined the Waterloo Wellington Older Adult Strategy as Geriatric Systems Implementation Facilitator. In this role, she works with the health system, community partners, older adults, and caregivers to enhance the collaboration and innovation to support older adults in aging well. So she looks at both upstream supports for those who are healthy, as well as specialized geriatric services for those who are frail or living with complex chronic conditions. She implements the 10-year strategy through facilitating working groups and overseeing multiple projects with a focus on engaging and learning from local older adults and system partners to affect transformation within the region. And she does this all part-time. So she's just a super powerful person. Christine, it's a privilege to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. The privilege is all mine.
Christine, given your work and interests, I feel like we could talk about so many things. We could talk about Indigenous art. We could talk about geriatric services for our aging population. We could talk about working with and learning from older adults. But today we're going to talk specifically about a recent project of yours, and that's the development of a training course called Caring for Older Indigenous Adults in Waterloo Wellington. And full disclosure for our listeners, this is a project that I also worked on jointly with Christine for about a year. So we know each other and we know this work. But Christine, I'm going to let you do the talking. So I want you to start by telling our listeners a little bit about this project, how it came to be, and its main goal.
Sure. So the project really started from our Indigenous Relations Working Group, which was a rather new working group when I first started with the Older Adult Strategy. It came out of a knowledge exchange day focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And folks across the system said, we really need something focused on Indigenous relations in particular, recognizing the special relationship with us living and working on Indigenous lands, with things like the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action and how they interact or interface with the healthcare system. And so out of this working group, there were some trainings that we took from IPHCC and SANYAS, excellent Indigenous created trainings that gave a great context of the history on a countrywide or federal level, as well as a provincial level, and some of the cultural humility practices that we can engage with. We recognize that different parts of the system, so when I refer to different parts of the system, I mean in terms of healthcare, we have things like home and community care support services, we have community support services, we have our hospitals, acute care, we have primary care, so your general practitioner who you go and see, nurses, all kinds of people. And all across that system, different people have taken trainings to varying degrees depending on the level of management they're at as well. And so we saw that there was a lot of information available, but we also saw that it was piecemeal and patchy depending on where you were at. And we saw that it was all very high level, that there wasn't a lot that was localized. And there wasn't a lot that was really tangible, sort of practical skills of how do I go about enhancing care for Indigenous older adults. And so that was the context. So we engaged Dialectic, and yourself, you came on the project, and we started consulting with local Indigenous older adults through a beautiful sharing circle
Mm-hmm.
and learned a lot about their personal experiences, some of the history, some of those social and distal determinants of health that contribute to those experiences. And from there, we continued talking to Indigenous led organizations, elders, knowledge keepers, and so many in the community, and learning so much along the way. In fact, too much to
Absolutely.
put into a
Yeah,
training.
absolutely. And we'll talk about some of those learnings in a minute because, like you said, there were so many, way too many to cram into a single course. And just being part of the development of this project kind of put you and I also, to an extent, in a position of really doing that engagement work and kind of living the practices that we were trying to teach others and figuring out the path, right, through all of the relationships that had to be developed in order to respectfully develop this course. So I think
Mhm.
that's why there's so much value in this conversation. And in a roundabout way, we are getting to our main question. We have to have this main question, right? And so today it is really, we're focusing on how should people and organizations approach the task of indigenizing or decolonizing their services. And this is a very complex question. It's a broad question. But today, I'd love to explore this with you, Christine, in terms of what you've personally learned through your work in this healthcare project. And so, to begin, maybe we could talk about why it's so important for healthcare and other social services to work toward Indigenization and reconciliation with local Indigenous communities. So, I wonder if you could
Absolutely.
speak to how this benefits Indigenous communities and individuals, and also how it benefits care providers.
For sure. So I think there is, at a very high level, there are some governmental directives, of course, saying this is work we need to do. You know, the TRC, 22nd Call to Action for Healthcare Providers, United Nations declarations, things like that. But there's also a very humanistic, sort of moral, ethical reason we need to do this. And certainly on a professional level, healthcare providers have a duty of care. And in order to ensure that we are providing the best care possible for Indigenous older adults through the work that we do, we need to actually know and understand Indigenous older adults. And so one of the best things in terms of engaging with Indigenous communities and building those relationships is that you do get to provide better care, as is the job you do. But it is also the opportunity for so much unlearning
Mm,
and learning and understanding some very different worldviews and approaches to healthcare, which in many ways intersect with some of the current trends that biomedical or Eurocentric healthcare systems are moving towards. And so, an example of that is when you're working with Indigenous communities, you very quickly learn that how they approach health and healing is much more holistic. It is including the social, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, and the physical health care. And then you think of our systems right now, and we are slowly starting to move towards things like social prescribing, things like let's enhance more of our mental health functions and offerings, because we know this has a huge impact on the physiological health as well. So there's a lot of learning we can do from the way they approach health and healing in order to enhance our care for everyone,
hmm.
as well as for Indigenous older adults specifically.
Right. Yeah. I just hearing you speak that has brought back so many little snippets and memories for me. Like I remember Elder Nina DeShane saying that she wanted to invite healthcare providers to learn from their community about how to grieve, for
Mhm.
example, right? And that was
Mm.
that really stood out to me as something that she said, and I was surprised to hear her say that, but that, they had this um all of the ritual and the attention and the community building around something like death and dying and grieving that is sometimes missing in our biomedical system. And I thought that was a really interesting angle as well. But that's just one of, like you said, so many different ways that we can just sort of shift our perspectives of about what's important. And there's so much wealth of learning there.
Mhm,
Absolutely. Yeah.
mhm.
In your experience in doing this kind of connecting work, have you found that Indigenous communities are ready and willing to foster relationships with kind of settler individuals and with these Eurocentric or biomedical organizations that are providing care?
On the whole, yes. I
Mm,
would say that when it comes to reaching out to Indigenous, whether it be individuals or communities, they're hungry for it. They
mm,
want to work together. They are inviting us quite often for these learning opportunities. They're very open. They're expecting mistakes to be made because we're human, and it's actually really built into their culture in beautiful ways. From the Métis side, I've talked with you before, Dominique, about how when they're beading, one of the things they do is intentionally put a mistake into it. And that's to
mm-hmm.
remind them that, like, hey, we're human, and this is a part of the journey, and the journey is the important part of it.
Right.
And when you're engaging with Indigenous individuals and communities, it is all about the relationship building. And that's, they want it. They want to build the relationships. They want to be in a better position. They want to help us be in a
Mm-hmm.
better position because we lose out when we block that, when we don't have those relationships, when we don't get to have that learning and engagement with each other. So they are ready. There are definitely certainly individuals who there's a lot of trauma and there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
pain. And so there will be times you come up against that. And that brings up a really important part of engaging with Indigenous communities is timing needs to be on a different scale.
Mm,
Time, patience is required. Things don't happen as quickly. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is they conceive of time differently, but also because it is about building a relationship. And when you're building a long-term relationship, you don't need to make a decision in, 1 hour, 24 hours, something
yeah.
like that. It's a
Yeah.
long-term thing. And so you need to take the time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But on the whole, yes, they're ready. They want it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think that is genuinely sometimes the hesitation, right? Can stem from this fear of what if I'm not wanted or invited, given the history that we're starting to understand and unpack. And as settlers, there's sometimes like a lot of guilt, and getting over that to actually initiate relationship can be challenging. But I'm with you on that. Like I also did find lots of inviting folks at the other end of phone calls and meetings and an invitation to sort of to participate and to build something new together. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. I think that this is like a beautiful segue kind of into talking about some of the specific ways that you ensured that the voices of older Indigenous adults and community leaders were reflected in this project. Like, what did the relating actually look like? What's the shape of that?
And I think when it comes to building those bridges, building those relationships, time was an important piece, but so was really actively, intentionally going out to find people,
Mm,
really actively and intentionally thinking about how am I going to engage? I want to do it in a culturally humble way. So I'm going to do some reading. I'm going to ask a lot of questions. I'm going to make sure I prepare myself as much as possible so that when I go, for instance, I now know I'm going to offer ceremonial tobacco, and I'm going to offer it with my left hand, which leads to, is, it's closest to my heart. And I'm going to wrap it in organic cloth so that it can disintegrate and go back to the earth. And all of these different pieces, which fit in to their worldview, but
mm,
also is a sign of respect. So there were very tangible pieces like that. There were also important pieces around that engagement requires you to recognize the diversity within Indigenous communities and across Indigenous communities. Here in Waterloo Wellington, we're on the ancestral homelands of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and then on the historical record, Attawandaron, sometimes called Shinaatin or Neutral. And to know that, yes, there's some similarities between these different peoples, but there's also a lot of difference in how they approach things.
mm-hmm.
And to not, broad stroke it as one. And I should also mention, of course, a lot of urban Indigenous people and Indigenous people coming from other parts of Canada, Inuit, for instance. So keeping that in mind in terms of engaging in relationships was really important. And then really understanding this community-centered approach
Mm-hmm.
that if I'm going to give great healthcare to one individual Indigenous older adult, I actually need to connect with their community too. I need to understand that community is medicine for them, that community is a part of me understanding them as an individual and all of those determinants of health, and being able to connect them to the services they need. If I don't have a relationship with the community, how am I going to connect them to an elder, a traditional healer, to spiritual care, to community supports that are culturally relevant?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how do you find who to make that initial connection with when you're trying to develop a relationship with a whole community? Who speaks for the community and how do you know? And how do you, as an outsider, kind of find your way into the right conversations?
It's a little bit of a web, to be honest. And so I think the easiest thing to start with is to start through a personal connection.
Mm.
There's a lot of more trust then. And so we started by going to people who already had some connections with community. There were some tables with Indigenous partners in the Waterloo region, for instance, and we connected through them and we asked, is anyone willing? Another way we went about it was going to a training was open to the public at Crowshield Lodge. We had an opportunity to do some learning there. And then in that moment saying, hi, I'd like to talk to you more. I'd like to start building this relationship so that there is a starting point. It's not just a cold call, so to
Yeah.
speak.
Yep.
Although I will say that when you're working with Indigenous communities, calling and being in person is like the best way to go about it versus an email.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
again, it's very relational. It is very personal then.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like this work took us into people's homes and
Mm-hmm.
onto people's lands and, right into their offices and so on. So absolutely that personal piece was what is very different culturally to the way that certainly as a course designer, you don't usually get to have that level of relationship with the people that you're working with. So
Mm-hmm.
that was something that was surprising for me, certainly. Were there any other lessons that you learned about, building relationships between your organization and local Indigenous communities? Like you had to sort of also act as a bit of a go-between, if you will, right? Like bringing back that knowledge and that experience and connection, and then informing things on the organizational side. Is there anything about that you want to share?
So I would say on the whole, they were very excited by the work that was happening. We together created a report before the module and sent it out to all kinds of partners who have since come back and said, hey, we're embedding this now in
Mm,
our annual planning. Like we're taking these as recommendations for the work we're doing.
amazing.
It's such a great outcome. But then there were certainly moments where sometimes I felt I would like to have some members of the system come with me on these
Yeah.
visits so they could really understand what I was trying to communicate to them. Because there's some things you can't just say with words. The
Yeah.
experience of being on the land and listening to traditional teachings around the fire, smudging, like that's a full body experience and
Hmm.
it's a communal experience. And so I can use as many words as I want. It will never feel the same, which is partly why the training says make sure your next step is to
Yes.
get out on the land
Yeah.
and actually be out there and learn in that way. So there were some challenges with that, but I would say organizations are, again, hungry for this knowledge. They
Hmm.
want to do the right things. And so very open to listening and to learning and to taking next steps to engage themselves. Certainly, I've seen some SharePoint pages go up now with a lot more information and connections available. There were some questions, for instance, around SEMA being tobacco and those working in addictions and things like that. How do we
Right.
navigate that. And ultimately, I think they did a beautiful job of coming to terms with and understanding the specific context and the specific usage, and ensuring that they were still very respectful and using ceremonial tobacco in an appropriate way. So there were lots of challenges here and there, but again, just really great openness and
Mm.
willingness for people to adopt as much as they can and to look towards transformation. And just on the other side of that, sometimes it's about the person you're speaking with and how much grounding and context they have.
Yeah.
And it's on both sides. You know, there are those in Indigenous communities who've been doing this work a long time. And so they don't need as much context in terms of how our policies and systems work and require. And then there are those who haven't done as much and are going, what, why do you have to jump through all of these hoops, so to speak? And the same on the other side, going, you know, we can't change everything. And me saying, you don't have to change everything. There are smaller things we can move around to get where we need to go.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like that willingness, that openness really does have to be present as sort of that foundation for this work to be successful. Is there anything
Mhm.
else that you could point to that has made the uptake of this work from an organizational perspective successful?
Leadership,
Mm.
um, education.
Mhm.
So when I encounter leaders who have done some education themselves, whether it be through trainings or through our engagements, it goes a long way. And it makes sense because when you have an understanding and some background in it, then you're more willing to listen to what might I change here. And you're going to set the tone for the rest of your organization. And so I
Mm.
do think it's a really key piece is that the leadership have that educational element first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully the course that you made can, provide some of that for those who have that missing piece. Do you want to take a minute just to talk a little bit about the course itself and
Yeah.
maybe some of the components or what people can expect to learn if they were to engage with this course?
Yes, absolutely. So the course, I think there's a few pieces which are especially important. One of them is giving more local context. So really saying, who are we talking about? Who are the Indigenous older adults we're supporting in the Waterloo Wellington region? And it gives some great context for our local health service providers. With that said, there is also general enough context that I think people outside of the region are going to benefit from it too,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
especially because it gives some background through storytelling of things like residential schools, which a lot of people, of course, have heard of, but far fewer people had heard of things like Indian hospitals,
Mm-hmm.
like day schools, 60 Scoop. So it gives a few more pieces of that history that does speak to a broader context as well. But the local context was really important. The second piece is how tangible it is. So there were so many health service providers who said, I've done these trainings and I'm ready and I want more, but I don't know how. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I ask a question in a way that's not going to be insulting? How do I ask a question in a way that then I can give more in response? And I have at least a basic foundational level of information now to provide back to the Indigenous older adult or family member that I'm supporting. So,
Mm-hmm.
those tangible, very practical how to pieces on things like identification, on enhancing our spaces, on providing referral pathways and supports that are Indigenous led in the community. And then the final part of it is really focused on building those organizational relationships, those relationships between your organization and Indigenous communities. Because as we've already said, community centered care is the crux of caring for Indigenous older adults. And so it's really important to put together a plan of how to do that. And again, I love how practical, and credit to you, how practical this is
Mm.
in terms of how am I going to build that relationship? Well, here's your guide.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can fill this out and say how many times I'm going to meet with someone, who am I meeting? What is the difference between an elder and a knowledge keeper? And,
Yeah.
am I meeting the right person? What kind of meeting am I having, etc. So really tangible pieces.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And thank you for articulating that. I think the course has so much value, having participated in its creation and seen it myself. I definitely agree that it's of great value. And I do hope that the practical pieces that are in there are kind of that missing step for so many folks who have a little bit of previous training, but don't quite know how to take that next step. So yeah, I want to encourage people to take this course too. And before we sort of talk about where it can be accessed and all of those details, I want to do a little bit of dreaming. So I'm going to take a moment to just read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for healthcare. So these are 22 and 23, and I'll just read them out.
Mhm.
We call upon those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of Indigenous healing practices and use them in the treatment of Indigenous patients in collaboration with Indigenous healers and elders where requested by Indigenous patients. And we call upon all levels of government to increase the number of Indigenous professionals working in the healthcare field, ensure the retention of Indigenous healthcare providers in Indigenous communities, and provide cultural competency training for all healthcare professionals. So, Christine, if healthcare and social service organizations truly took up the challenge of the TRC's calls to action, what would be different about our region?
I think what would be different about our region is that it would be more integrated in terms of the care from Indigenous-led organizations and non-Indigenous biomedical organizations. You certainly have this starting to happen, which is very exciting, where relationships are being built. But it would be nice to say if I go to any hospital across this region, if I
Right.
go to any primary care provider, etc., that they are actually going to know who they need to call if I need specific care that is Indigenous led. So, really building out those referral pathways. Also, I would love that every office or every space that an Indigenous person walked into would be one in which they felt welcome.
Mm-hmm.
They would no longer have that same level of fear because of everything that's happened, that, they would see familiar art and objects around the room, that they would know I'm safe here. And
Mm-hmm.
safety, that feeling of safety, and I don't think this is a castles in the sky sort of discussion. I think this is actually achievable
Yeah.
if we take something like this training as a foundation and then continue with the on the land training with the very practical pieces of implementing them into daily care with the building of relationships, especially.
Yeah. Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree that your vision of utopia is completely feasible and not that far away. Like it feels very much within reach. And what a wonderful world that would be for Indigenous community members, for older adults who have gone through so much and whose trauma is so often just swept under the rug and not acknowledged in healthcare spaces as they are. So I think that it is a tremendous challenge, but also one worth taking on. And that vision of that practical kind of application, right, is just so important. And it's the missing piece.
Mhm.
So let's talk about the course. So for our listeners, would you tell us the Caring for Indigenous Older Adults in Waterloo Wellington course? When is it being launched? Who has access? Where can they get access?
Sure. So the course is having an official ceremonial launch on February 22nd. That's being led by Elder Mengan Henry from the University of Waterloo. And that will be a small, very intimate sort of launch with those who have been a part of it and some of the Indigenous community members that we've been working with. And from that point on, it is going to be out there and available. It's on the Geriatric Essentials learning platform. Anyone can access it. They have to register, but the registration is free. There's certainly also opportunity if someone wants to put it onto their own LMS system, that sort of thing can be arranged. And yeah, we want to get it out there. We'll push it through social media, we'll push it through partners. I actually had someone from the Healing of the Seven Generations this past week say, hey, can I share it please with
Yeah,
Indigenous partners from across Ontario? And I said, absolutely, please put it, it's yours too. You built this with us. So
yeah,
put
yep.
it out there for as many people as possible to use and hopefully benefit from it.
That's wonderful. And so I'll drop some of that information into the show notes for anybody who wants to take a peek or click through to places where the course will be shared. And as a last step, Christine, during the project, you and I became aware of some of the great work of so many local Indigenous organizations. So I want to ask you, is there anyone in particular, and I know this is hard because we talk to so many beautiful, open-hearted, brilliant, committed people, but is there anyone in particular whose work you'd like to amplify today?
I'm going to say two. The first one I'm going to say is Dr. Kathy Absalon from the Center for Indigigogy, and that's at the University Wilfrid Laurier.
Mhm.
And it's a great place for finding lots of information, especially information for people in the healthcare field in terms of Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous approaches to healthcare, being mindful of the traditional approach and braiding it with the biomedical approach. So I think that's a really great place to look, an academic approach, but not any academia you've ever encountered.
Right.
And then the other piece is Crow Shield Lodge, who I've already mentioned once, and the opportunity to do on the land training, because the connection to the land for Indigenous people is just so fundamental as a part of their being and a part of their worldview. And Clarence has a huge passion for the work that he does and is also very willing to connect you to other Indigenous organizations and community members. And I could
Amazing.
tell you like 100 more,
Yeah.
but
And
I'll leave
so
it at
many
two.
more, yeah, so many more are embedded in the course too. So
Yes.
lots of local resources mentioned in there. Excellent starting points for anybody who is looking for education and opportunities to support ongoing work. So thank you for sharing those resources. Christine, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you about this project.
Pleasure again, all mine, and a privilege too. I love sharing this work. It's so important. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, you're absolutely welcome. If anybody would like to stay connected with Christine Platt, I will add the links to her socials in the show notes as well. And as always, I welcome any of our listeners to reach out to me if you would like to be a featured guest on this podcast, or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. My email address is in the show notes too. If you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique Atrell. Thanks so much for listening and see you next time on Just One Q.